You know, usually when we think about how our brain is currently processing the visual world around us, we just assume it works a lot like a really sophisticated digital camera.
Right, like it's just taking high-definition snapshots.
Yeah, exactly. Like you look around the room you're in right now, and your brain just neatly recognizes whole objects. There's a coffee cup or, a laptop, maybe a house plant in the corner.
It feels entirely seamless.
It really does. It feels like the neurons in your head are just snapping these photos and instantly matching them to this, neat alphabetized catalog of whole items you've seen before.
Well, I mean, it feels completely intuitive to us because that is the end product of perception. We experience a perfectly coherent, structured world, so it's totally natural to assume our underlying biology is wired to detect those coherent things.
Right.
And for a long time, the scientific community operated on a somewhat similar assumption. We thought visual neurons were either highly specialized for very basic physical properties.
Like what, like the harsh angle of a geometric line?
Exactly. Or the depth of a shadow. Or we thought they were at the very top of the chain, encoding high-level categorical concepts. A neuron for faces, a neuron for places, a neuron for bodies.
But then you actually look at the modern neuroscience of the visual cortex, and wow, visual neurons are far, far weirder than a simple catalog of objects.
Oh, absolutely.
So we are doing a deep dive into a groundbreaking Nature neuroscience paper today by researchers Bingsu Wang and Carlos R. Ponce, and they designed an experiment that just sounds like science fiction.
It really does.
They essentially gave macaque monkey brains a digital paintbrush. Like they hooked up the monkey's visual neurons directly to two different generative AI models and basically let a single biological cell draw what it most wanted to see.
Which is just a phenomenal way to get at a core mystery that has been frustrating neuroscientists for years.
Yeah, tell me about that mystery.
Well, when you actually probe a single visual neuron deep in the brain with a massive random set of images, the way it responds completely shatters our expectations.
That's out.
You might find a single neuron in the inferior temporal cortex that fires wildly at a picture of a centipede and then fires just as wildly at a red pickup truck and then spikes again for a suspension bridge.
Wait, a centipede, a truck, and a bridge.
Yes, exactly.
If you're trying to find the common denominator there, you're going to give yourself a headache. I mean, there is literally zero semantic relationship between those three things.
None at all.
They don't mean the same thing, they don't look anything alike to us, and they definitely don't belong in the same category. Yet that single neuron is screaming, yes, that is exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah. It's wild.
Okay, let's unpack this. How in the world do we figure out what a neuron is actually looking for if we, as humans, can't even see the pattern ourselves?
Well, that human inability to see the pattern is actually the root of the problem. We suffer from a massive cognitive bias.
Right.
When we look at a crowded, complex scene, our brains immediately and forcefully isolate whole objects. We completely lose the ability to see the raw, constituent local features that make up that scene.
So we can't help but see the whole truck. We can't just see the specific curve of the fender and the particular gradient of the paint.
Precisely. So the researchers hypothesized that these visual neurons are actually encoding something subcategorical. They're looking for critical features.
Critical features. Okay.
Yeah, these little recurring textures or geometric motifs that appear across completely different, unrelated objects. But because our human brains refuse to let us see those raw features, the researchers couldn't just guess what to show the monkeys.
They had to hand the steering wheel over to deep generative networks.
Exactly.
So to solve the mystery, they used AI as a sort of translator. The paper refers to these models as statistical decompositions of natural images. Which brings us to the two distinct AI artists they employed for this experiment.
Right. So they utilized generative adversarial networks, or GANs. And what makes GANs so incredibly useful for this kind of neuroscience is that they don't just memorize pictures. They learn the deep statistical regularities of how visual elements fit together in natural scenes, and they can produce completely novel combinations.
Wow.
And they do all of this operating within a mathematical landscape called a latent space.
A latent space. I always like to think of a latent space like the most complex audio mixing board you've ever seen in a high-end recording studio. But instead of audio, it's for visual ingredients.
That's a great analogy.
Instead of sliding dials to increase the bass or reduce the treble, you have mathematical dials, these vectors. By turning these vector dials, you can smoothly morph an image from one state to another.
Yes, you can blend completely unknown intermediate patterns, tweaking the visual recipe to see exactly what makes a neuron react.
And for this study, they didn't just use one mixing board, they used two radically different ones.
They did. The first generative model they used is called DeepSim. We can think of DeepSim as a purely abstract texture artist.
Okay, abstract textures.
It has an absolutely massive 4,096 dimensional latent space.
Wait, 4,000?
Yeah, over 4,000 independent dials you can turn to change the image. It produces these highly expressive, completely non-photorealistic textures. They don't contain coherent objects at all.
So just weird blobs and patterns.
Exactly. In fact, DeepSim can extrapolate way beyond its original training data into these bizarre, scrambled landscapes of colors and organic patterns that don't even exist in the real world.
And then you have the second artist, which is Biggin. Biggin is the realist photographer of the pair.
Right.
It was trained on ImageNet, which is this massive, famous database of categorized, labeled photos. Biggin has a much smaller, tighter 256-dimensional space, and its entire purpose is to produce photorealistic, object-centered images.
Dogs, cars, birds, landscapes, things that look entirely real and recognizable to our eyes.
Wait, I'm stuck on this, though. If the ultimate goal of the study is to figure out how our brains process the real physical world we live in, why overcomplicate it with the abstract texture AI?
That's a really good question.
Like, why not just use Biggin, since it actually generates things that look like the real world we interact with every day?
Because relying only on Biggin would trap the researchers in the exact same human bias we just talked about.
Oh, I see.
Because we perceive the world as objects, we build our AI systems to generate objects. But the macaque monkey's brain, which is remarkably similar to our own visual system, might be processing the world using abstract, critical features that don't look like objects at all.
Right, right.
By bringing in DeepSim, which speaks a purely textural, non-semantic language, alongside Biggin, which speaks a rigid, object-centric language, the researchers created two fundamentally different visual vocabularies.
So it forces the neuron to show us what it really cares about, completely independent of our human obsession with things.
Exactly.
Okay, let's do a quick mini recap before we move on. So first, we know neurons fire at wildly unrelated things like bugs and bridges. And second, to figure out why, we are hooking those neurons up to two different AI artists, one that paints pure, chaotic textures, and one that paints neat, recognizable objects.
That's the setup.
Which brings up a question for you listening right now. If you were a single visual neuron, do you think you'd prefer a chaotic, abstract texture or a perfectly formed object?
It's a fun thought experiment.
So to find out what the neurons actually preferred, the researchers had to invent a way for the biology to actually communicate with the code.
Right. They needed to establish a closed-loop optimization system where the monkey's brain activity directly controlled the AI generation.
Let's get into how they actually pulled that off. They worked with 4 macaque monkeys measuring 3 specific areas of the visual cortex.
Okay, let's break down the areas.
There's V1, which handles the very early, lower-level visual processing, kind of the mailroom of the visual cortex. Then V4, which handles intermediate processing. And finally, key IT, the posterior inferotemporal cortex, which is much higher up the processing chain.
Kind of closer to the executive suite where complex recognition happens.
Yeah, exactly. So what did they do with these areas?
They implanted floating microelectrode arrays into those areas, allowing them to monitor the firing rate of individual neurons or small clusters of neurons in real time.
Okay.
Then they deployed an evolutionary algorithm to act as the bridge between the electrode and the generative AI. It's called CMAES.
You can picture this algorithm like playing a wildly fast game of hot or cold.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to look at it.
And the monkey is sitting there, simply staring at a screen. The AI generates a tiny batch of images, maybe 3 to 5 completely random starting pictures. It flashes them on the screen for just 100 milliseconds each.
A tenth of a second.
Right, super fast. The microelectrode measures how intensely that specific neuron fires in response to each picture. If image B makes the neuron fire slightly faster than the others, the algorithm registers a warmer signal.
It gets warmer.
It takes the mathematical code of image B, evolves it, tweaks the dials, and generates the next batch based on that new direction.
And generation by generation, the image physically morphs on the screen to maximize that single neuron's excitement.
And crucially, they ran this evolutionary game for both AI models simultaneously, right?
They did. They would have one evolutionary thread searching through the DeepSim abstract texture space, and another thread searching through the big-N photorealistic object space.
Oh, interleaved.
Yeah, they randomly interleaved these flashes so that if the monkey got tired or distracted, it wouldn't skew the results toward one AI over the other.
That's really smart. And the images that came out of this process are just staggering. Let's look at the specific aha moment the researchers highlighted.
The monkey A example.
Yes. They were tracking a multi-unit in the PIT area, that higher-level executive suite we talked about of monkey A. When the big N evolution kicked off, the initial random image looked like a blurry, vaguely alpaca-shaped blob.
Right.
But by the time the neuron was finished guiding the evolution, steering it purely through its firing rate, it had morphed into an incredibly detailed, photorealistic bird-like creature sitting on grass.
Which is amazing on its own. But meanwhile, that exact same neural site was also playing hot or cold with the DeepSim algorithm.
Right, the texture artist.
That evolution started as a totally amorphous, colorful patch. But generation by generation, the neuron steered the abstract dials until it stabilized into a smooth, brown, curved surface.
And this is the part that broke my brain. The photorealistic bird on the grass and the abstract brown swoop, they look globally completely different to our eyes.
Oh, completely different.
They share no obvious resemblance, yet they evoked the exact same peak firing rate from the neuron. The level of excitement from the brain was statistically identical.
Yep.
Wait, how is that possible? Does the neuron just have, like, multiple completely unrelated personalities? I know the paper mentions the idea of superposition, where a neuron just randomly responds to two completely different, non-overlapping things. Is that what's happening?
Well, that was the immediate suspicion. Superposition or polysemanticity is a known concept where a network node essentially moonlights, doing two different jobs. But the researchers hypothesized it wasn't random at all. They suspected the neuron was actually fixated on a hidden, shared detail that existed in both the bird and the abstract blob.
How do you even prove that?
They utilized spatial attribution masks. They took an older, highly mapped neural network called AlexNet and used its layers to mathematically extract the features of both the final big N image and the final DeepSim image.
So they essentially used a third AI to scan the artwork of the first two AIs.
Exactly.
Mapping them out pixel by pixel to see what was actually driving the reaction.
Precisely. They mapped the features onto a grid and used linear regression to predict the neural responses based on those specific local zones.
And what did they find?
What they discovered was that the neurons were zeroing in on shared local motifs. Even though the global picture was a realistic bird in one and an abstract blob in the other, both images contained the exact same localized geometric feature.
So the specific sweeping curve of the bird's neck in the big N image perfectly mathematically matched the identical curve in the brown DeepSim blob.
You got it. The neuron never cared about the concept of a bird. It only cared about that specific subsemantic curve.
That is just wild. Okay, let's do another quick recap. So to make sure I'm wrapping my head around this, these monkeys' neurons played a rapid-fire evolutionary game to paint custom images.
Correct.
And even though the two different AIs drew completely different big picture scenes, the neuron was actually just zooming in on a tiny shared detail, like a specific curve or color patch that it managed to build in both environments.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Think about how you recognize a friend in a crowded room. You don't always need to see their face or their whole body, right? You just catch a tiny glimpse of the way they walk or the specific tilt of their head, and your brain instantly knows it's them.
A tiny localized detail conveys everything.
Yeah. So to you listening, have you ever experienced that? Have you ever recognized someone just by a tiny detail before seeing the whole picture?
It's a great real-world example of what we're talking about.
So where do we go from here?
Well, that concept of local details, building the whole picture, is the perfect segue into the next phase of the study. Because once the researchers established what these neurons were actually hunting for, they needed to map out the geography of the brain.
Right. Does every part of the visual cortex operate this way, or is there a chain of command as the signal travels deeper into the brain?
Exactly. Let's trace that pathway.
Okay, so they tracked the success rates of the evolutionary game across those different brain areas. And success simply meant the algorithm was able to significantly increase the neuron's firing rate over its resting baseline.
Right. And down in the lower processing areas, V1 and V4, the neurons were absolute texture lovers.
Texture lovers, okay.
When paired with the DeepSim abstract texture AI, V1 had a 100% success rate. 10 out of 10 evolutionary runs resulted in a massive spike in firing. V4 was nearly perfect too, succeeding in 37 out of 38 runs.
Wow, so they really love the abstract stuff.
They really do. But the moment they forced V1 and V4 to try and communicate using the Big N object AI, the communication completely broke down.
Oh, really?
Yeah, V1 failed utterly. 0 successes out of 10. V4 only managed to guide the AI to success about half the time. It turns out these lower visual areas are rigidly tied to texture-based, non-object parameterizations. The vocabulary objects is simply useless to them.
Wow. But then the signal travels up to PIT, that higher order processing area we talked about. And PIT turns out to be fully bilingual.
It is.
It achieved comparable success rates no matter which AI it was talking to. It had around a 61% success rate with big N objects and a 67% success rate with deep sim textures.
So it was just as happy to sculpt a photorealistic bird as it was a brown abstract blob.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It's not just about what part of the brain is processing the image. Time plays a massive role.
Oh, definitely. We were talking about neural dynamics.
Neural dynamics, okay.
Biological neurons possess a critical dimension that most artificial vision models completely lack, which is time-varying responses. The researchers didn't just look at a flat average of the firing rate over the entire time the image was on screen.
What did they do instead?
They sliced the data into incredibly tiny 10-millisecond windows.
10 milliseconds. I mean, the blink of an eye is about 300 milliseconds. So we were talking about slicing a blink into 30 separate frames.
Exactly. And when they looked at those microslices of time, the PIT neurons, they found a distinct delay. When the images flashed on the screen, the PIT neurons responded to the deep sim abstract textures first. Yeah, the early transient response, the very first spike of activity, heavily favored the textures. But as the milliseconds ticked by and they entered the late sustained response window, the dynamic flipped.
They started to favor the objects.
Yes, the neurons began to favor the big N objects.
Man, this is such a profound look into how we actually build our reality. Think about waking up in the middle of the night in a dark room. You look in the corner, and for a fraction of a second, you just see a dark shape and a rough texture.
Right, your brain is scrambling, processing that raw data.
And then a few milliseconds later, it suddenly clicks, and your brain says, oh, relax, that's just a jacket hanging on a chair.
That's a perfect example.
That millisecond delay is your brain shifting from processing raw textures to assembling the final holistic object.
Yep.
Let's do another quick recap. Lower brain areas are rigid texture workers. Higher areas like PIT are bilingual, and those higher areas process the raw materials just milliseconds before they comprehend the whole object.
You got it.
So, audience, can you feel your own brain doing this? Seeing a shape and a color before your brain clicks and says, oh, that's a car.
It's happening constantly, every second of the day.
So what did the researchers look at next?
Well, the precision of that process led the researchers to their final major question. We know what the neurons are looking for, and we know exactly when they find it. But how picky are they?
Picky in what way?
If a neuron loves a specific sweeping curve, what happens if that curve is just slightly off? They wanted to determine the mathematical shape of a neuron's preference.
Okay, to map that out, they used a technique called Hessian tuning, which I have to admit sounds incredibly daunting.
It does sound intimidating.
But Hessian is really just a mathematical way of exploring the curvature of a landscape. They wanted to explore the space immediately surrounding the perfect image they had just evolved.
Right, so they took the final, most optimized image from the big N evolution, the one that made the neuron fire at its absolute peak.
Okay.
They isolated that image's exact coordinates in the latent space, and then they started deliberately tweaking the dials. They moved the mathematical vectors along 10 to 20 different orthogonal axes, fundamentally shifting the visual features in multiple diverging directions to see how the neuron would react to imperfections.
I think the easiest way to visualize this is to imagine a neuron's preference as a physical mountain. If the AI perfectly optimized the image during the hot or cold game, you are standing exactly at the peak of that mountain.
And that is exactly what the data showed when the optimization was highly successful.
Right. If they tweaked the image in any direction, moving away from the perfect curve, the firing rate dropped off smoothly and symmetrically in every direction. It created a perfect, classic, bell-shaped curve.
However, if the evolutionary algorithm had gotten stuck early on, perhaps it couldn't quite find the perfect feature and ended up resting somewhere on the side of the mountain, the data looked very different.
What happened?
If they took the image and tweaked it so it moved toward the true ideal peak, the neuron's firing rate didn't drop. It shot straight up. Right. That created a steep, ramp-shaped curve.
Oh, wow. So it's not a rigid lock and key mechanism where it either matches perfectly or doesn't fire at all.
Far from it. This proves that visual neurons operate in complex, high-dimensional tuning landscapes. They don't just have one fragile, specific trigger.
Right. They possess a broad topological map of visual preferences.
Exactly. They can smoothly navigate variations in the real world, increasing their response as the visual input gets closer to their ideal critical feature.
Man, bringing all of this staggering neuroscience together, we've gone from the illusion of seeing whole objects to AI mixing boards to macaques playing evolutionary hot or cold to discovering that a bird and a blob share the same mathematical curve.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So I'm going to turn to you to synthesize this. What is the fundamental paradigm shift here? How does this actually change our understanding of the brain?
Well, the paradigm shift is the complete dismantling of the template theory.
The template theory.
Yeah. For decades, the underlying assumption was that the brain stored whole object templates, like a distinct, holistic template for a cat or a car or a coffee cup.
And this paper blows that up.
This paper provides profound evidence against that. Object recognition does not arise from matching a holistic template. Instead, it is a compositional code.
A compositional code.
The brain extracts these weird, abstract, subsemantic critical features. The specific curve here, a texture there, a color gradient over there, and it dynamically pieces them together on the fly. It constructs the world from the ground up, moving from raw texture to coherent object in a matter of milliseconds.
Wow. It is actively building our visual reality from scratch, nonstop, using a secret language of textures and local motifs that we are completely blind to consciously.
That's the beauty of it.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If our biological brains, the most advanced visual processors on the planet, are essentially building reality out of abstract, subsemantic textures rather than whole objects.
Yeah.
Think about how we are currently trying to build artificial general intelligence. Right now, the standard approach is to train AI vision models to recognize dogs and traffic lights and crosswalks as whole, prepackaged concepts based entirely on human labels.
We give them the end result.
Exactly. We are forcing these networks to see the end product, skipping the underlying compositional code entirely. Are we inadvertently forcing machines to learn the visual world backwards?
It's a really compelling question.
Something for you to think about next time you glance at the coffee cup on your desk, because your neurons certainly don't see a cup. They just see a beautifully specific curve of light and texture, and your brain is just telling you the rest. Until next time on The Deep Dive.